Appreciate everybody being here this morning. We are trying something new this morning. I'm trying to figure out how to get things on the website, talks and stuff that are not so terribly time consuming. So trying out my cell phone as our recording device this morning. So, and actually my cordless microphone works into my cell phone. So I got to test that today. So otherwise there's a problem with distance and getting clarity. So anyway, I told Tracy I would do that have this all working before she comes back the next time, so we can record her. So this is kind of a test to see if this process works and how well it works. So, but I appreciate everybody being here this morning. Appreciate Tracy's talk last week. It was she kind of hit me right where I needed to be hit, so and moved me around a little bit in my thinking. And I saw a flaw in my character I think to work on. And that's what I needed. That's really what I needed last week. She so wonderfully brought that back to me. And it is, I don't always confront things that need to be confronted when things aren't working well for me. Things seem out of bounds for me. I'm reluctant to say anything about it. I kind of will bow to authority and I will choose the more gentle path instead of the path maybe that would be change things and bring some additional transformation to me. So change was happening, but I wasn't always choosing transformation. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about a little bit today. You're also going to get a little bit of my journey in New England, because what is that really about? You know, the term they use for people who go up there and come up for the color change, and it is their biggest tourist season. The fall foliage change is their biggest tourist season in New England. I didn't know that, but you learn a lot of things when you're on a trip like that. That's one of them. And we got a dose of that. We went downtown Boston on Saturday morning, and there's lots of places to park. There's this beautiful big building. It's out of gray stone, and it's one little fast food restaurant after another. There must have been 40 or 50 down this long corridor with the big rotunda kind of in the middle. And everything you can think of, from Indian food to Thai food to all kinds of seafood and Texas barbecue. One place on Texas barbecue. And it was just amazing. There was no place for our bus to park. By the time we got around to there, there's probably parking for 20 or 30 buses. And they had to drop us off on a corner and then come back and pick us up later. And we were there to shop a little bit and to eat lunch that particular Saturday. And when we got in that building where all these little fast food kind of restaurants were, it was shoulder to shoulder. It was just so crowded. And then they were telling us, oh, this is the peak tourist season for their area. And what they call the people who come up there to do that is leaf peepers. Being from here, I never heard it put that way. I said something to somebody, I was in Vermont, something. I said, oh yeah, I'm one of the leaf peepers. He said, that's really meant as a derogatory comment. I went, oh, well, I take it the other way. I choose to take it the other way. I'm a leaf peeper, and I am up here because of the change. Did you know that wasn't always that way? We take for granted that the way things are today is the way things always were. I was telling Joyce this morning, there was a program I watched on the Science Channel many, many years ago, up to almost 10,000 years ago. The Earth spun on a perfect square axis. It was not tilted. And one of the things they said at that time, the polar ice caps were much, much heavier. And that's when we also had the glacial periods. But the Earth spun straight up. There was no fall. There was no spring. There was no summer. It was always the same. And at that particular time, the Sahara Desert was a tropical forest, tropical rainforest. And today, it's the largest desert, one of the largest deserts on our planet. But they have found whale bones west of Egypt in the Sahara Desert. They have found whale bones out there. It was part of this inland sea that was big enough for whales. And some scientists a few years back piped water into the far western Sahara Desert, piped water in there, and they took an and they built a frame, and they made it rain, just like it might have done in that time. And all kinds of foliage began to sprout. And it became that 1 acre, with all the water they added to it, became a rainforest. And plants they had never heard of, things they'd never seen, sprouted out of the ground. All those seeds from 10 millennia ago or more were laying there dormant. And all of a sudden, it was like, with their interference with today, they brought it back to what it had been. And they don't know what happened. We now tilt on 22 degrees off center. And that's what gives us our season changes. And as the earth wobbles and goes around the sun, it gives us our summer, winter, fall, and spring. But prior to that time, it wasn't that way. Isn't that interesting? And they don't know what happened. I was talking to Joyce, she said, God must have said, "Oh, I don't like it that way." From her background. Hey, I think if God wants to do that, it works. So I don't really have too much trouble with that. But whatever. God does it, anything God wants to do, any way He wants to do it. Or she. It. So, but there was this big change in our whole planet. So what we see today and take for granted today isn't the way it always was. Isn't that interesting? So, but all the species of life on Earth have adapted to the way it is today. And that's what change is really about. Without change, we're not challenged. I'm not challenged unless something changes around me and then I have to respond. And I'm generally not a responder, I'm generally a reactor to change. But reacting isn't what leads to real transformation. It's knowing it's coming, being involved in what's coming, work my way through it, and come out on the other side different. That's the opportunity of change. So if change doesn't happen in your life once in a while, you have very little opportunity to grow. Most of us are, I call myself lazy. I have tends to be really quite lazy. So it takes a it takes a truck coming by to kind of often get my attention off of just the status quo. I'm really often kind of happy with just kind of the status quo. But change is going to happen. Change always happens. I saw some big changes on the trip. That was the reason for going. And so I'm going to share a few of my pictures. That's the Old North Church. We got to go out and walk around Boston a little bit, and it was sprinkling. I had to carry an umbrella that day. It wasn't real heavy. We weren't getting really wet. But, so you can see the picture? Yeah. So anyway, this is where the lanterns were hung that Paul Revere saw and went on his famous ride. Well, he didn't go alone. It was at least 100 riders went out to tell the colonists that the British were coming. So he was just one of them. And it's Wadsworth, more than a century later, that makes Paul Revere famous. But Paul Revere was one of at least 100 riders. And he lost his horse, and he had to take a rowboat across the river, and he had to do a lot of things to accomplish his mission. So that's one of the things we got to see. And coming from here, well, there are things that are old. Because this predates the Revolutionary War. I don't remember the date. The date was around. I may have it on some of my stuff. But that's a picture of the. And of course, this is really the reason for the trip. The foliage change. Here was a pretty contrast. The tree behind it hasn't started turning. Several of the trees are evergreen, so they're not going to change in the same way. They're not going to have a color change. They're going to drop lots of leaves or lots of needles. God, that's a mess sometimes. But anyway, I thought that was a nice contrast, so I showed that. So some things are changing around us, other things aren't, and that's the way life is. And here's a nice demonstration in nature of how life really works. Somebody else around me is not having the same challenges and changes that I'm really putting up with too. So I made note of that on the trip. And we saw one true, real covered bridge over a creek. And this is in southern Vermont. And we stayed at on Mount Snow. It's a huge ski resort in Vermont. And the hotel we stayed at had probably 500-600 rooms. It was big. Of course, it's off season for that, so there weren't very many of us there at one time. At that particular time, I think there were 3 bus loads of leaf peepers. And anyway, we were leaving one morning, and this was only about 3 miles from where we were staying. So we stopped and looked at this real covered bridge over a creek. And I took lots of pictures.
Did the bus didn't drive through it?
No, it didn't. It could have, I guess. It was tall enough. It was big enough for him to have really gone through it. But it was
be load rated for it. It might have a different load rating.
Yeah, and it might be what's up on the top. I could blow this one up and look at those. No, it doesn't. It doesn't give the load rating on it. But this is in Dover, Vermont, and where we stayed, and a few people on the trip. Anyway, it was really wonderful to at least see one covered bridge while I was in Vermont and New Hampshire. True covered bridge. I saw one later, but it had been moved several times. They built a dam, and the water was going to back up over and fill in the creek and fill in the area where the bridge was, the covered bridge was. So they dismantled it and they moved it to a park. Well, then they decided they didn't like it there, so they moved it, and they ended up moving it to a country store. We went to a couple of different old Vermont type country stores while we were there, and which was interesting. The last one had everything virtually you could think of in it. From they had lots of candy, which most places do, but they had clothing, and they had a big tent outside with a big sale going on. They had those sliding porch swings, they were for sale. They had some really wonderful things. So this was the Vermont bridge, again, because their winters are so harsh there. That's why the covered bridge, to protect the roadway, make it easier to get across. And actually, some of the early covered bridges, you had to pay a toll to use the bridge. A local guy would build a bridge, and then he would charge you a toll to use his covered bridge in the wintertime. So, anyway, interesting ways people made money back in those times. And this was a nice aerial, almost an aerial shot. I'm 200 feet up in a monument in Bennington, Vermont. And it was right after we saw the covered bridge. And as you can see, there is some color, but again, it's not even peak color time. And also, one of the things that happened is at Mount Snow, where we were staying, the day before we got there, they had a heavy, heavy rainfall. You know what that does to them leaves? It washes them right off the trees. So when we got to Mount Snow, the color there was very little color. And one of the guys at the hotel said, sorry it rained the day before. He said it was really pretty, but here's an area that didn't receive quite as much rain. And in Bennington, they had a battle during the Revolutionary War, and there's this huge monument, and I'm up in it. It's 200 feet. The monument is 200 feet high, and where the viewing area is 200 feet high. And I had a sweater on that morning, and we went up there, and the windows were open. And at that altitude, the wind was so much stronger. It was cold. You thought you stepped into a freezer up there or something. But they wouldn't let you walk up to it anymore. Anyway, and that shows that not everything, again, is changing at the same time. Change occurs, it's individual with each tree. And it's individual branches within the trees, too, that are changing individually. So when you really look at it close, again, change isn't just a blanket swipe with a big brush. It's a really individual leaf by leaf almost happening in there. And this you couldn't see, but right down that road that I was taking a picture of is a church. And it is the first church in Vermont to be dedicated to the separation of church and state. And they got a plaque outside that says this. And built in the time of the Revolution, too. And one of the interesting things is at least 10 couples, 10 people of the 30, it was probably more than that, of our group were British. They were from all over England, and I had not been around a big group of English people. And after we visited some of the sites that honored the Revolutionary War, from our perspective, I asked one of the ladies, I said, from a British perspective, kind of how does that feel? And her husband, and I was talking with her and her husband, and she said, there's some negative feelings about this for us. There really is. I said, well, I was wondering, I think if the shoe being on the other foot, I would have felt the same way. If they're celebrating a loss that we occurred. And then she asked me a really kind of pointed question. She says, how do you Americans feel now that maybe China is taking over as the prominent force in the world leader in some ways? And I said, that has a bird to it too for us. You know, seeing our position in the world maybe slipping away a little bit. There's a change going on there. I said, and something she didn't know, I said, you know, I think China right now owns about 50% of the United States anyway. They have purchased so much over here and they've invested so much over here. And she wasn't aware of that. But then her husband said something real interesting too, right after that. He said, you know, if y'all want to come back, we'll take you back. I said, I don't know that that's going to happen. This church had been remodeled a couple times. You notice that it has the individual pews for the families, the square sections that the families sat in. And if you'll kind of look down in there, see if you can point it over. There's the cushions go 3/4 of the way around from the door, so the whole family sat in there. But the kids had to sit facing away from the pulpit. So the adults, the mother and dad, sat facing the minister, and the kids were delegated to sitting behind. And they had actually remodeled the church and taken all this out. And then later the church was given, about 30 or 40 years ago, was given to a local university there in Bennington. And they spent 4 times more money than was originally spent on the building to put it back the way it was. So they went back and added, they had just regular pews like most churches do around here, long pews for people to sit in. But then the university went back and decided the building was still structurally very, very sound. It was built very, very well. But they wanted to bring it back the way it was originally. So they put it back in this particular shape. And this is when the time when they founded this church, the families bought the pews, the square boxes, and they used that money to build the building. That's how they financed the building of their building. And you'll notice also the pulpit is really up high. There's a chandelier almost in the way. I asked the lady there, oh, there's the pointer. There is where the pulpit is. I said, can I walk up there? Because there's a staircase on each side leading up to it. And she says, no, a man fell a while back, and so fell trying to go up there, so we don't let anybody go up there. But I thought it was kind of interesting. I see how things were, and it's one of the first Protestant churches in Vermont, too. But it was the first church dedicated to separation of church and state. And all the changes that happened. And there's a big cemetery right adjacent to all this, and Robert Frost is buried there. Well, he wasn't living there when he died, but he was mad at New Hampshire. He was living in New Hampshire. He got mad at New Hampshire, and so he had him buried in Vermont. So we made the little journey. It was about 1/4 of a mile down into the cemetery to find the tombstone and the grave of Robert Frost. Now here's the monument that I was up in. And where the big slats are at the top, they're a little hard to see from back there. They're right in here. That's where I was standing when I was taking these pictures, and it was cold. It's 300 feet high, and it's a monument to the big battle they had there.
What kind of stairway was it inside?
You weren't allowed. They have an elevator, and you were not allowed to take stairway anymore. It's no longer considered safe. But I got a picture at the inside. There's this big round, almost looks like a huge can. Excuse me, huge can, but there's a door in it, and it's the safety way to get down. If the elevator fails, you can take the stairs. But if you get to the bottom, the stairs are locked. So, but you could get down. Anyway, and at that particular time, it was really, really cold. It was a real surprise. I never heard about the Battle of Bennington. So we heard quite a bit about it at the time over there. And then after that, we went to, I should have made that bigger. We went to an old farm. We've been in the same family for 3 generations. And this is there's probably a name for it, I meant to look it up. This is their maple house. This is where they take all the sap, and they still make maple today on the property. The trees in the back over here that are, whoops, wrong button, are kind of grayish. These are maple trees over in this area. Of course, we all know about tapping the maple trees and so forth. We got a big lesson on that. And it takes early in the season, which starts before the snow's gone, it takes about 40 gallons of sap to make a gallon of syrup. And later in the season, it takes about 50. The quality changes. Also, the early syrup is the real light, real fine grade. The later syrup is the more coarse. There's a change in the way the tree is responding to it being tapped. So I didn't know that. I didn't know that changes too. Change is just absolutely everywhere. And one of the big changes on this farm we visited with, each generation has had to find a different way to make a living on the farm. The man that was taking us on the tour had just sold the property to his son. His son was 50-ish, and he was in his middle 70s. And he talked about his father. His father was really a blacksmith, but he had this property, and he raised sheep and cattle and so forth. But the way he made most of his money, and you've probably seen it on a Kruger and Ives print or some old prints from New England, he built this, he used to put it on the sled, this big container that they went around with that had metal bands around it, and had a big opening to dump the buckets of syrup in. He developed that and went to Washington and patented it and made his whole living selling those containers. And they held about 200 gallons or more of syrup. But it was made to fit either on a wagon or on a sled. Because he talked about the busiest time on the farm is the winter time. And here the busiest time on the farm is spring, summer, and occasionally in the fall. But in our area, winter is a dormant time. But in New England, and especially in the past, New England, the busiest time of the year is the winter time. He said, for one reason, he said, when the snow falls and when the ice comes, he said, you tie the horses to a sled and they can pull 10 times what they can pull in a wagon because of the movement of the sled on the ice. He said, so more cargo was moved in the wintertime than was ever moved in the summertime because it was so much easier, because the ice on the roads just made it work so much better. Again, something that we don't think about here. This is, I think, one of the prettiest pictures I got of the whole trip. You'll also notice if you get up close, there's a bunch of big stack of wood right here. It takes a lot of wood because they have to boil it down to make the maple syrup. Maple syrup is still a big export commodity, and it's really quite expensive. Even up there, it's really quite expensive. But he talked about how as times changed, they had to be adaptive on the farm to keep the farm. Now, a whole lot of their money comes from tourism. That's how the son today, now the grandson of the man who originally had the property, is making a big chunk of his living is taking tourists around. They have this special wagon they made that 30 of us could sit on, and they pull it with a tractor around their property. And it brings them the income they need to stay in business. When he raised, the grandfather raised sheep. And one time, Vermont was deforested 80%. When sheep and wool was the biggest commodity. And then when the cotton gin come out, wool went away. People wanted cotton clothing, didn't want so much wool clothing. And there was a huge change, there was a huge migration at that time, which was the middle 18th century. And when the cotton gin comes out, and all of a sudden, and now Vermont is 80% forested. It has reverted back because the sheep aren't there, the goats aren't there to keep the land, and they're not trying to keep it in pasture land. You can't hardly grow anything else there except trees because it's such a rocky place. Vermont and New Hampshire both are very, very rocky places. So the soil is really very deep, but it works great for the trees. But it was interesting to listen to them talk about how change had to continue to be reoccurring so that they could keep the property in their land. They even were raising emus. They had a flock of emus, and they had sheep, and they had goats, and cattle, and they even raised fish in a pond. But he said that was a bust because the birds were eating the fish. The rafters in the area were taking about 100 trout out of his big pond every year. So he said we put 100 in, and then we still only have 100. He said the birds come in, the heron and the hawks and so forth, and they eat their fish. So that one didn't work so well. Except I'd love to go down there and fish. He banged on a rock and threw a little feed in the water, and they just churned the water up. The trout that was in there, that would have been some really good eating. But again, change was happening all over the place, and they were having to adapt. They were making the choice to continue to live on the land, to live the life that their ancestors had lived and that they wanted to live. And it was interesting listening to them talk about how they were having to make these decisions to do things differently on a regular basis as change kept occurring in their lives and their environments. So as change happens to us, we have a choice. We can be reactionary to it, or we can just virtually let it just flow on around us, or we can use it as a catalyst for being different. And I think maybe that's what the universe had in mind when the earth tilted. Things are too stagnant here, maybe. I don't know. I don't know if God reached up with his hand and tilted the earth. But it did provide change. It provided a very different world. And humans were alive when this happened on the earth. Our distant ancestors were there for all that enormous change to happen. So we can only speculate over and over again what it was and how they coped with that. But we are all coping with change all the time. There's change in your health, there's change in the people around you. People come and go in your lives that make changes too. So it's our opportunity to take that change, take it down internally, and do something different. Make ourselves better. It's choice. We need to step up and make choices, and that's part of what I saw last week in Tracy's talk. I'm sometimes not standing up and making the changes that I need to make. So my commitment to myself is to be changing for the better, being more of what I can be. Can we help you? Anyway, that's what ends up taking me to New England. There was change. The fall foliage change. That didn't dawn on me. It didn't dawn on me this week until really I started thinking really deeply about change. As change comes in, let's do something positive with it for ourselves. We always have that opportunity to be more positive. I think that's what it's about. Being more of who we are really, and being better. So, thank you. So we have our morning prayer, our treatment for this morning. With change in my mind, changes that happen around me, I still know what Tracy talked about last week too. There is that unchangeable part of me internally, where the life force of the universe flows and Max appears. The same for Tommy, and Teresa, and Carol, and Jackie, and Sherry, and Kathy. That's why we're here, is because the energy of the universe moves, and it moves through us, and we exist. And we have thoughts, and we have feelings, and we have experiences. have this wonderful opportunity to do. It's all about doing. But to do well, I need to know. I need to know the truths of the universe. And the truths of the universe are peace and harmony. It's love and abundance. And it's joy and it's laughter. Those are the deep, unchanging truths of the universe. And I know that that is the center of who I am. As Tracy was telling us so clearly last week, it's the center of who you are. It is that does not change, even though everything around us can. But through those changes, I do choose to grow, and I know you do too. And I know that as the changes appear, all different kinds of things come up for me. But as I anchor myself in the truth of myself, I know that abundance is my true nature. I know that love is my true nature. I know that peace is my true nature. And I know that when I don't experience them, it isn't the universe doing it to me, it is me doing it to me. So as I see that happening and I recognize that truth, I gently step out of my own way and I let the natural flow of the universe come through. And as that happens, I'm restored. I'm restored to love. I'm restored to peace. I'm restored to harmony. I'm restored to abundance. As Emerson said, getting that bloated nothingness of who I am out of the way. And the bloated part he's talking about is ego. It's not the part of who we are. It's that blowing up of ourselves, of ego, that we see in and around us. But as change happens, I see that, and I let it go. I let ego melt away. I let ego do its proper thing in my life, protecting me, keeping me healthy and whole. That's ego's job, not to run my life, just be a part of it. And I'm so grateful for knowing the truth. I'm so grateful for being able to, on many occasions, activate truth in my life and participate in truth. And I hold that for you, and I hold that for all of us. I hold that for Pamela this morning. I hold her truth to wholeness and completeness and perfect health, perfect life. And I'm so thankful. I'm so thankful for the teaching that brings us all together. The teaching that provides us with a wonderful opportunity to do the positive things with change, to grow and be more because change happens. I'm so thankful for that. I'm so thankful for my opportunity of life. I'm so thankful for our opportunity of fellowship. I'm thankful for your opportunity of life too, for our deep expression of that. For that's how God is here. And we know that truth too. And with that grateful heart, I take all the words and thoughts and feelings of this treatment and I release them to that part of God we call the law, the doing part, so things happen. It's waiting for our thoughts to do that. So we impress our thoughts on it gently.